I'm going to go ahead and apologize in advance. Not that I'm going to offend anybody, but I've been battling a little bit of a cold and congestion and headache and tiredness. Maybe I have COVID. No, I don't think that's what it is. Only because I think I already had it. Although they tell me you can have it again. And I'm still trying to figure out this whole vaccination thing. So I was reading up on the vaccination because I was interested. Not that I was going to get it, but you get the vaccination, and they tell you that you still need to wear a mask, and you still need to social distance, and there's no guarantee you won't get COVID. So why are you getting the vaccination? Some people are getting it because they have to. They don't have a choice. If you work in healthcare, you don't have a choice. The hospital doesn't give you a choice. You have to. Jeanette's sister works at a hospital, and she didn't have a choice. She had to get it. But I just thought it was funny that you get the vaccination, but you still have to social distance. You still have to wear a mask, and you still have to, yeah. Okay, that's not what I wanted to talk about. It just, if you guys remember, a couple weeks ago, I told you about Eli's incident with lying to me. You remember that story? And we put him in timeout, and he and it worked. And you know how I know it worked? Because now, not every time, but about every other time, he comes and asks me for a piece of candy because he knows that if he eats all of his dinner and he asks for a piece of candy, we'll give him one. And so now when he asks me for a piece of candy, he reminds me that he is not lying. And so he should get a piece of candy. He learned his lesson. He's the kind of kid, you don't have to put him in timeout for very long before he learns his lesson. Because the first couple of minutes are the worst for him. And, I make him stay there for more than a couple of minutes, but the first couple of minutes are the worst for him. And that's when he learns his lesson. More so than staying there for a long period of time. And I started thinking about discipline. Okay, everybody has their own ideas and philosophies and interpretation, even of the Bible, on how you should discipline. And it's amazing some people's view. And it's not that it's wrong per se. Some people don't believe in spanking, and there's nothing wrong with that. I personally, I don't believe in spanking at certain ages. When Eli turns 21, probably not going to spank him anymore. I might beat him down, but I probably won't. I don't know. He's going to be a big boy. He might be bigger than I am. I might not. When Eli was 3 months old, he never got a spanking. Yeah. So it's the same thing with anything that you do as far as discipline is concerned. Things don't, things you can't handle you can't handle a person the same way their whole life, and it amazes me how sometimes we try and do that. And I know when Eli gets into the teenage years, that I'll probably have to start taking things away from him. Go sit in timeout probably won't have the same effect as it does now. And so, but in the midst of discipline, what is your goal in disciplining? What is your desire for your child or your grandchildren, or what is the ultimate goal for discipline? Now, I don't think, I think there's a a benefit from disciplining that we receive that is not necessarily a goal, but as parents or grandparents, whoever, we receive this benefit. And one of it is honor. You see a kid that is well behaved, and people see that and they think, man, their parents did a good job with that kid. Unfortunately, I have never had any of you come up to me and say, you're doing a good job with Eli. I don't know how to take that, but I'm okay with it. He's a good kid. He's one of those passive kids. And we got to be careful because sometimes we think that a passive kid is more obedient than an aggressive kid. And that's not the case. It irritates me sometimes when an aggressive, a very extrovert kid, and they seem to be rowdy more times than not, when people criticize parents for a kid being rowdy when that's their personality. Just because your kid is a little rowdy doesn't mean they're not disciplined. And just because your kid is reserved doesn't mean they are disciplined. I mean, we need to be aware of that. And I wasn't going to say that, but it came out anyway. So if you need to hear that, good for you. What it does when we see a kid behave well is it brings honor to the parents. People, maybe not verbally, but mentally, praise the parent for being a good parent and disciplining their kids. And in honesty, I think all of us would agree that it's nice to hear that we're doing a good job with our kids. It's nice for somebody to say, man, your kid is well behaved. That's just great. You're doing a good job with your kid. And then when somebody tells you that, you go home and you say, I'm such a terrible parent. You know, that honoring thing in dealing with kids transfers over to our spiritual life. If you believe it or not, it does. And we're going to look at that. We're going to look at the idea of obedience bringing or praise. Just as a child, if a child is obedient and people notice that, it brings praise upon it produces praise for the parents. And our spiritual lives is the same way. When we, as children of God, behave in a certain way, it produces praise to our Father. And I want to look at that. We're going to look at Daniel chapter 6 this morning. And if you don't know what story that is, it's the story of Daniel and the not-so-hungry lions, as what some people I've heard it called before. Daniel, at this point in his life, is an extremely old man. I don't want to say extremely old man. Pastor Marcia is not here, so he was about 70. He was in his 70-ish. Pastor Marcia would say, well, he's still young then. To most of us, he would seem kind of old. That's where he was in his life. He had been serving in Babylon his entire life. If anybody had the right to question God and what God really wanted, it would have been Daniel. But what we find is Daniel never really questions God and continues to be faithful to God. Faithfulness is not new in the book of Daniel. If you remember last week in chapter 3, we talked about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That's right, Abednego, that's how you pronounce his name. And in that, we see God's faithfulness to these three boys as they were thrown into a blazing furnace. You know, those two stories are tied together in more ways than you might think. If you remember, you probably don't, so I'll remind you, a while back, I talked about a literary form called a chiasm. And a chiasm is just a way they wrote to emphasize something. And go ahead and throw that picture up here. I'll show you what I'm talking about. So, yeah. Okay, we didn't want to see that anyway. So what a chiasm is it states certain things, and then it kind of states those same things in reverse. So go ahead and leave that up there. So, A, the first thing, and this is, if you remember, I also said chapters 2 through 7 of Daniel, those chapters are written in Aramaic. The rest of the book is written in Hebrew. Those were written in Aramaic. And those fit into this chiasm. Chapter 2 is a prophecy concerning 4 Gentile empires that dominate Israel and the world. And it's the story of the statue of gold, silver, bronze, and iron. I referenced that last week. In chapter 3, we see God delivers Daniel's friend from the Gentile persecution. That was last week. We talked about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. C, God humbles a Gentile king, Nebuchadnezzar, to demonstrate his sovereignty. That's chapter 4. The vision of the tree, and the king becomes like a wild animal eating grass like a cow. That just grosses me out, by the way. Then we go, we talk about the same ideas in reverse order. So we go C, God deposes a Gentile king, Belshazzar, to demonstrate his sovereignty. Chapters 5, and that's the writing on the wall. We're not going to talk about that, but there's 4 words that get written on the wall, and Daniel comes in and interprets it, and the king actually dies not long after that because he was not giving God the authority that God deserves. Then we read B, which is what we're going to talk about today. God delivers Daniel from Gentile persecution. And then back to A, the prophecy concerning 4 Gentile empires that dominate Israel in the world. And that's the vision of the 4 beasts. So in this section that was written in Aramaic, we see this chiasm, and what it does, it has a specific purpose. It wasn't just, hey, this is a cool way of doing it. I think I'm going to do it that way. There's a specific purpose for writing it that way. You want to know what it is? Come Wednesday night and I'll tell you. But I will tell you this. I don't want to go into it because there's more to it than just one statement. But it has to deal with the sovereignty of God. The sovereignty of God. And actually that's Pastor Marcia and I are going to share on Wednesday evening. We're going to look at this more in depth and share a lot of ideas of what really is going on in those 6 chapters. But today, I want to talk about something. I want to talk about producing praise. And now, those of you who joined us last night we had our night of worship over at Nishna Valley. It was awesome. You guys missed out. If you didn't make it, you missed out. And I actually I gave a devotional. So I gave kind of a condensed version of this sermon last night. And I know some of you are thinking, well, he needs to do that this morning too, condensed version of this sermon. I'm looking to see how much time I have left. Okay, so Daniel chapter 6, verses 1 through 5. Darius the Mede decided to divide the kingdom into 120 provinces, and he appointed a high officer to rule over each province. The king also chose Daniel and two others as administrators to supervise the high officers and protect the king's interest. Daniel soon proved himself more capable than all the other administrators and high officers. Because of Daniel's great ability, the king made plans to place him over the entire kingdom. This is not the first time God has done this. Brought somebody from outside of the nation into a foreign nation and made them second in command. Verse 4, then the other administrators and high officers began searching for some fault in the way Daniel was handling government affairs, but they couldn't find anything to criticize or condemn. He was faithful, always responsible, and completely trustworthy. So they concluded, our only chance in finding grounds to accuse David will be in connection with the rules of his religion. It's important to understand here that Daniel's faithfulness was not just to Yahweh. His faithfulness was not just to Yahweh. It was also to the human king that he was serving. And sometimes the Bible's pretty clear. Paul talks about that if you have to make a choice between serving or following God's law and following the king's law, you are to follow God's law. There's no question about that. And we see that in this story later on, and we're going to talk about that. But sometimes we as Christians, when we don't like a law that our governing body has placed, instead of following that law, we try and find somewhere in the Bible that might disagree with that law so we don't have to follow it. Listen, if you have to look deep into the Bible to find a law because you don't like this law, chances are you're making excuses for not wanting to obey this law. We don't have to like the people who govern us. But the Bible makes it pretty clear that we need to respect and obey them as long as it doesn't compromise our obedience to God and His commands. Now, that doesn't mean when you're filling out your taxes that you don't claim every bit of those dollars you don't want to pay. Claim everything you can, as far as you can without breaking the law. But the government doesn't need money. I don't like the way they're spending my money. Well, I don't either. But did you know when you break the law, and it's not for the reason of following God's law, you are breaking God's law? So think about that. The next time you don't want to do something the government tells you to do, or you want to do something the government tells you not to do, when you break those laws and they're not contradictory to God's law, you're breaking God's law. And we shouldn't just dismiss it. The amazing thing about Daniel is that his enemies did not find anything to criticize or condemn him about. Nothing. I wish I could say that there was nothing in my life that could be condemned or criticized in how I handle things. I'm sometimes considered inconsiderate. And I understand. I don't think of other people as much as I should. It has been said almost the whole time that I've been alive that I don't like certain people. Listen, don't assume that I don't like you because I don't talk to you. If I tell you I don't like you, guess what? I don't like you. I'll tell you. Most of the time. We create these preconceived ideas about people, and we make assumptions about people, and then we start to criticize the assumptions we made about somebody. And it's really important that we, and I mentioned this at the very beginning with kids, but with adults too, it's really important that we understand that our view and assumptions about people are 99.999% wrong. Because you, unless they come out and tell you, you just don't know. Sure, they're not doing something that the way you would do it, but does that make them fit your ideas? Listen, we all have faults, and the best thing that we can do is live up to them. Not live up to them. You don't want to live up to your faults. Is claim up your faults, admit to them, and try and do better. Try and do better. Daniel, on the other hand, there was nothing to criticize him about or condemn him about. And so because of that, these high officials, these administrators, they figured the only way that they could get Daniel fired, removed, or even killed was to make up a charge or make up a situation that would cause him to break the law. And they realized that the only way that's going to happen is if it's a law regarding his God. Verse 10, but when Daniel learned that the law had been signed, he went home, knelt down, and as usual in his upstairs room, with his windows open toward Jerusalem, he prayed 3 times a day, just as he had always done, giving thanks to his God. Now, if you don't know the situation, you read that and you think, way to go, Daniel. You're the man. You went home and you knelt down and you prayed upstairs inside your room toward Jerusalem 3 times a day. Yeah, but did you know that that was against the king's law? For those of you who know the story, you know that. But if you don't know the story, what happened is these administrators didn't like the fact that Daniel was favored by the king, so they wanted to get rid of him. So they went to the king and they said, hey, King Darius, let's make a law. And let's say that for 30 days, you are the only one that anybody can pray to. And if they break the law, they get thrown into the lion's den. And what they did was they told King Darius that everybody, all of the administrators and high officials were in agreement. Problem was, they lied because Daniel didn't agree to this. But they lied. The king said, okay, let's do this. Sounds good to me. And then they went over and they watched. I'm sure they were sitting there. They were probably sitting out with their big old glass of sweet iced tea, drinking iced tea, just looking right at Daniel's window, just waiting for Daniel to poke his head at that window so they could go up there and they could arrest him. And they did. And they brought him before the king. And that's what he did. When he learned the law, some of us probably would have done it a little differently. When we learned about a law that says we can't do something that God says we can do, we try and hide it. I'm sure that if it was me in that situation, I pray I wouldn't do this, but I probably would have closed the window instead of opened the window. So Daniel prays as normal. He does his normal 3 days, 3 prayers a day. They come and they get him and they bring him to the king, and the king has no choice. Didn't want to because he really liked Daniel. Listen, Daniel was really good at what he did, and what he did was make the king money. So why else? I mean, of course, you don't want to get rid of the golden goose, do you? That's kind of where Darius, but I think it was more than that. I think he actually had a fondness of David because of David's faithfulness. And, I think David was a really likable guy unless you were jealous of him. So they're going to throw him in the lion's den. And so a lion's den, you kind of went, well, what in the world is a lion den? Is it like a hole this big around that a bunch of lions are in and they just drop you down inside there? Well, when we were in Israel, we went to a place where there was a big cavern, and probably it was about as big as this room, maybe a little bit bigger. And it wasn't like a hole that you drop down into. it was like this side of the room was was open and all of that, and it went down, and there was water down there, and that's probably what that looked like. It was a really big room, and there were lions down there, but they couldn't get out, and so they just kind of threw David in there and Daniel. Yeah. Threw Daniel in there. You guys know me right now. I'm going to do that, so just yell out the right name, and I'll get it eventually. Threw Daniel in there, and I don't know if they were expecting to see an instant return on their treachery or not, but we know that Daniel stays in there all night, and we know that King Darius did not sleep well. And early the next morning, but let me back up for a minute. There's a statement that I want to emphasize real quick, because this is a powerful statement that I pray would be said about all of us, and that is in verse 16. There's this very informative statement that King Darius makes as they throw Daniel in the lion's den. He says this: "May your God, whom you serve so faithfully, rescue you." Why would he say that? Apart from the benefit that Daniel brought to him in his kingdom. Because he saw something in Daniel that proved that there was a living God. That's the only thing I can think of. That's it. I mean, what else? And it makes me... There's obviously a faithfulness that is seen, that is proved in Daniel's life. So it begs me the question, and I have to ask myself this question, and I pray that you will ask yourself this question. If charges were to be brought against you for being a disciple of Jesus, would there be enough evidence to convict? If people were to look at your life to try and find evidence of your discipleship to Jesus, would there be enough evidence in your life to convict you as guilty? But I go to church. Well, I go to church sometimes. And I read my Bible, In fact, I read my Bible at least every other day. I hang out with my Christian friends every once in a while. And while those are oftentimes the ideas that we throw out there to prove our Christianity, those are not the ideas that Jesus uses to prove your Christianity. What does Jesus say? Love your neighbor as yourself. Pray for your enemies. Listen, pick any one of the fruits of the Spirit. Do you see those things in your life? Are those the type of things that are in your life that could be proved that you're guilty of being a disciple of Jesus? Right now, there's nothing they'll call us haters for being Christian, or they might call us hypocrites or whatever. But there's no real punishment in America for being a Christian. But if Jesus doesn't come back soon, it could be at some point in time where there are more severe consequences for you having a relationship with Jesus. And let me tell you, if you are not willing to pay the price now, you will not be willing to pay the price later. If charges were brought against you for being a disciple of Jesus, would there be enough evidence to convict? So, Daniel's tossed in the lion's den. He stays there all night. The king comes back, and he's actually overjoyed to pull to pull Daniel out of the lion's den because, hey, maybe they were friends. He knows that Daniel's going to make him money. And something amazing happens at the end of this chapter, chapter 26, that shows my point exactly. And that is, reading verse 25 through 27, it says this: Then King Darius sent this message to the people of every race and nation and language throughout the world. Peace and prosperity to you. Okay, before I go on, I want you to understand something. This is everybody in the known world. Everybody. Not just America. This is not just Babylon, but everybody in the known world. At this point in time, King Darius was, the Medo-Persian Empire was the greatest empire on the planet. And actually was foretold by God that they would be that earlier in Daniel. And so it's not unbelievable to think that when he says this, every nation, every tongue, every race, language throughout the world, he's literally mean everybody who is in the known world and is alive will receive this message. Verse 26, I declare that everyone throughout my kingdom should tremble with fear before the God of Daniel. First, he is the living God, and he will endure forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed, and his rule will never end. He rescues and saves his people. He performs miraculous signs and wonders in the heavens and on earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. Daniel's obedience, faithfulness, and dedication to God brought about praise. It produced praise in a foreign king who really might not even have known Yahweh even existed before Daniel got there. That's a powerful statement of Daniel's life. That because of Daniel's obedience, Yahweh was praised. Not just in King Darius' life, not just in his kingdom, but through the whole known world. There's something to be said about that. And we sometimes don't quite understand the power that has in it. Daniel's obedience produced praise, but it's not just for Daniel. We look at this story, we say, hey, this is a great story, man. Way to go, Daniel. You did such an awesome thing. You influenced this king through God's power in saving you. That is awesome. Way to go. But I can't do that. I can't do that. Some people think they're not even responsible to do that. Most of us believe it's our excuse me. Most of us believe it is our responsibility to come into this room and sing worship songs and raise our hand and love on Jesus while we're here. And maybe even go home and love on Jesus while we're there and praise his name at home. Or even maybe while you're driving in the car. But did you know it is your responsibility to not only praise God, but to live a life so dedicated to God that other people praise God? We forget that part. Daniel was a prime example, but it says in Matthew 5, verses 13 through 16, you are the salt of the earth, but what good is salt if it has lost its flavor? Can you make it salty again? It will be thrown out and trampled underfoot as worthless. You are the light of the world, like a city on a hilltop that cannot be hidden. No one lights a lamp and then puts it under a basket. Instead, the lamp is placed on a stand where it gives light to everyone in the house. Verse 16. In the same way, let your good deeds shine out for all to see so that everyone will praise your heavenly Father. He's talking, Jesus is this is right after he talks about the Beatitudes. He's talking to the disciples. He's talking to you and me, and he's saying you should be living the kind of life of obedience that is so profound that other people, worship God. And yet many of us, I worship God at church, and I sing praises in the car when I'm going to work, and I think that's good enough. It makes me wonder how really committed we are to the things of God. Now, it's important to understand something. King Darius, he had many gods. Most of them did. Most of them served a lot of gods. And that was one of the problems that Yahweh had with Israel, is that they weren't serving Yahweh alone. They were serving all the other gods that everybody else had. So Darius, in reality, was not just serving Yahweh. He's probably serving all the other gods. But what Daniel did had a profound impact on him. Not that, and we don't see any indication in Scripture that he gave up all of his other gods. But what it did is it caused him to focus on Yahweh, which he had never been focused on before. In other words, what Daniel did moved King Darius in the right direction toward God, toward Yahweh. And that is our responsibility too. Sure, I would love it if living an obedient life just naturally caused other people just to start singing praise to God. It'd be a little weird sometimes, but, it would be awesome. But at the very least, what our obedience should do is point people in the right direction and maybe give them a little nudge. There's a lot we can learn from Daniel's life and producing praise. But I want to share 3 quick things that I want you to remember as we go about our day, our week, our month. The first thing is, Daniel was faithful, responsible, and trustworthy to Yahweh, to his earthly masters, pretty much to everybody he came in contact with. We have that same responsibility. When we make decisions, we need to ask ourselves, is this the faithful decision to make, the responsible decision to make? Is this the trustworthy decision to make? Another thing that we learned from Daniel is his obedience didn't come from his suffering, but led to his suffering. Let me say that again so you get this. Daniel's obedience didn't come from his suffering. It led to his suffering. Daniel suffered because he was obedient. His suffering didn't lead to obedience. His obedience led to suffering. He was thrown in the lion's den because he was willing to pray to Yahweh 3 times a day, even though the king said it was against the law. And because of his obedience to God, it led to his suffering. We have to realize that if we truly follow God, we too follow Jesus, we follow Yahweh, chances are there's going to be some suffering. Now, maybe you might not get thrown in jail, But maybe your suffering is having to deny yourself, deny the things that you want. Maybe the suffering is taking up your cross. Not things we want to do. Things that go against our nature. Daniel's obedience didn't keep him from suffering, but led to his suffering. It amazes me when I hear people people complain about some of the suffering that they go through. And here's why. Because they instantly think that the suffering they go through is directly related to their disobedience. Have you ever said something like this? God, why am I going to do it? What did I do to deserve this? Right? You ever said that? You're trying to equate your current situation, the things you're going through right now. You're trying to determine what in your past caused those things. And sure, there are consequences for the things that we do. We will face consequences. Listen, I love peanut M&Ms. Thank you, Pastor Chris, for buying me a 10-pound bag of peanut M&Ms. I gained a lot of weight eating those M&Ms. And I'm going to blame her. There are consequences for some of the decisions that we make. But we can't just say, and I can, it wasn't just be eating, over a course of several months, eating those M&Ms. It was all of the other carbs that I ate that helped produce the excess weight that I have, okay? But once we try and say, well, this right here is a result of my disobedience and my bad decisions, sometimes the suffering we face is not because of the bad decisions that we've made, but because of the good decisions that we've made. And God is molding us and forming us and creating us into the person that He wants us to be. The last thing that we see, or one of the last things that we see that Daniel does, is that when God saved Daniel, Daniel gave God the credit. He said, we go back up, I believe it's in verse 23, 24. Daniel pretty much says, God saved me. But this was no surprise to King Darius. Remember, he already told Daniel, may the God that you serve rescue you. I think sometimes we fail to give God His due credit. And it's normal, but just because it's normal doesn't mean it's right. And I'm scared about what they are going to start calling normal. Read an article the other day, I guess this was a couple months ago, but read an article the other day. There's some people who are trying to classify pedophilia as an alternate lifestyle. What? Now, again, we live in a world where good will be called sin and sin will be called good. We hold to our convictions about how God has made man and woman, and it's called hate. They try and say that pedophilia is a natural thing and should be embraced. No, what it is it's our evil and sinful desires trying to make its way out, and we're trying to call sin good. If you, I was talking with I was talking with the chaplain for our police force here in town, and he was telling me that there is believe it or not, I don't know if you know this, you probably do, maybe you don't, there is a little bit of a problem with sex trafficking here in Shenandoah. If you're not aware of that, make yourself aware of it. And here's the problem with sex trafficking is because if you don't do it right and you don't catch them at the right time, the only thing you can get them on is endangerment of a minor, which has very minimal penalty. We live in a world where it's very quickly evil is becoming good and good is becoming evil. And one of the ways to overcome that is to put God in perspective. Put God in perspective. When something good happens, I did a pretty good job. Man, I'm pretty proud of myself. Last spring, I built my workshop back behind my house. After I got done, I'm not actually done with it yet. I'm like your normal guy. I get 90% done and think, I'm going to be around for another 40 years. I could go ahead and finish that anytime. Stood back and looked at it and says, man, that's pretty good. I did a pretty good job. Who gave me the ability to do it? Who gave me the money to do it? My wife did. Thank you, babe. Daniel gave God the credit for the situation. And we need to learn that anything and everything good in our lives comes from God. So if something happens, yeah, I know I'm pretty good. No, we need to be saying, yeah, God's pretty good. God's pretty good. So, here's a challenge this week. And not just this week, make it your life challenge. Make it your life challenge to live a life that produces praise. Whether it produces praise in yourself, whether it produces praise in your children. One of the greatest things that I love to see, and I've seen some kids sitting, younger kids, when they're in the service, I look to see if any of them are worshiping or if they're just, sitting there. Listen, I'm going to be honest with you. I'm sometimes a terrible parent. When Eli comes and sits in here, I give him something to color on because I don't want to have to deal with it. I'll be honest with you. And he prays. We just started. This is in my notes, so we just started having him, because we did a prayer, the same prayer, kind of rhymes every night. So we just decided we're going to let him start saying his own prayers. The things that come out of kids' mouth. Jesus, help me not have any dreams. I guess he doesn't like his dreams. And Jesus, you can have dreams. He wants Jesus to have his dreams. But I don't know where I was going with that. I just thought it was funny. Are we producing praise in our children? Are we producing praise in our families? Even people like Darius, who believed in many gods, the power of God was so strong in Daniel's life. And there was a miracle. There was a miracle without a doubt. I mean, he's thrown into this den of lions, and he survived. And then when he was pulled out and the other guys were thrown in, they were devoured before they even hit the ground. This was not an issue of, the lions weren't hungry. No, that wasn't it. I believe Jesus was in there singing a lullaby, keeping him asleep the whole time. Producing praise. At the very least, proclaim God and get people to acknowledge and head in the right direction. That's what our obedience should be like. Stand with me. We're going to close in prayer. Heavenly Father, you are the same God that kept 3 Hebrew boys from being consumed in the flames. You are the same God that sat with Daniel in the midst of lions and kept their mouths closed. You're the same God that desires to be intimately involved in our lives. And we thank you for that. We don't deserve your love and your mercy, your grace. We don't deserve all that you have for us. But because you love us, you gave Jesus. Because you love us, you give us his peace, the peace that passes understanding. You give us the confidence of our salvation. You are so generous. And I pray right now that you would move on our hearts, not to avoid keeping this generosity all to ourselves. Let us leave this place. Let's walk out these doors so that and live for you. Live in obedience so strongly that it brings you praise. Give us that strength. We need it. We love you. We give you all the praise. And everyone say, amen. Thank you. I love you guys. We will see you. Hey, remember, if you want to find out more about that chiasm I talked about, be here Wednesday, 7 o'clock, and we'll talk about it. Be blessed.